want to start by taking a moment to acknowledge the land from where I'm joining you today. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of Patwin people. Today, there are 3 federally recognized Patwin tribes. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as the elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. Our speaker today is Joana Tavares. She is a marine scientist, an educator, and a mom. Joana is currently completing a PhD at the University of California, Irvine in the Earth Systems Science Department, where she is investigating the impacts of pollution on marine life with funding from NASA. She serves as a board member and community science advisor for local nonprofit organizations, including Amigos de Bolsa Chica and the Newport Bay Conservancy. Joana is interested in the intersectional environmentalism, the nexus between climate change and environmental justice, and the challenges and opportunities to effectively address systemic racism and cultural, social, and economic oppression. Joana, welcome to Cones.
Hello, thank you so much for having me here. It's a great pleasure. I'm gonna share my screen here so that we can get started. Oh, hold on, not so fast, everybody. I'm gonna stop my screen. Hold on just a minute, because we were testing this before, and now the slides are completely off location. All right, I don't know how to do this properly, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna share my screen, and you all have to close your eyes so that I can go back to the beginning. Is that okay?
That'll work.
Close your eyes, everyone. Otherwise, it's going to ruin the surprise. Okay, here we go. So as Greg said, I will be talking about environmental justice and thinking through this lens of how can we strengthen environmental justice and really see it as a path to solving the global climate crisis. Hopefully we will be what we'll have today is a discussion, is a space for us to share our thoughts. And before I begin, I just want to say that I am speaking with you from Irvine, and this land that I'm on and the surrounding areas are ancestral territory of the Achamin and the Tongva peoples, many that still keep strong and active physical, spiritual, and cultural ties to this region and the local environment. Now, before we begin, I just want to go over some agreements here, and I'm going to move this over here. These are adopted from the National Equity Project, and I just want to remind us all that when we discuss the topics today, we're going to acknowledge one another as equals. We are going to try to stay curious about each other. We're going to recognize that we need each other's help to become better listeners. We're going to slow down so that we have time to think and reflect, even if that means that we won't, that we don't cover all the materials that we've prepared to share. That's fine. And we're going to remember that conversation is a natural way in which humans think together. It gets messy at times, should be prepared for that. But we're going to take responsibility for our impact on others. We're going to be mindful of that. And as your main speaker, as the moderator for today's conversation, I affirm that I have fact-checked the information that I presented here today to the best of my abilities. I'm committing to present facts and my own opinions, and I'm committing to also differentiate between the data, the facts, and what my interpretation of the facts are in the most honest, transparent, and clear way that I can. And I vow to be respectful and patient with you all. I also ask you to be respectful and patient with me, because we will be sometimes talking across cultural, generational, social, political, and other differences that might exist between us. That should not stop us from having a positive dialogue. And then finally, but very, very importantly, I will be speaking from the point of view of allyship, as an ally. I am originally from Brazil. I identify here in this country as Latina, because that's what I am. And I am an immigrant to this country. But I did grow up in Brazil, and as you can plainly see, I am very white passing. And And so I benefited greatly from all the privilege that a white middle-class person has access to in a country like Brazil. And so I'm making this point here to emphasize that my talk today should not be seen as a good enough equivalent or a good enough substitute for presentations, talks, in experience shared by people who have indeed experienced oppression or experienced any kind of discrimination because of who they are or what their appearance is or any other circumstances in their lives. So my talk today is hopefully the beginning of a conversation, of many conversations. And so I will be mostly sharing thoughts that come from my background as an environmental scientist, and also as someone who sees the value in environmental justice, and also as someone who's very keen on building community around causes that I think are important, shared causes that we should all be building community around. All right, so I'm going to start by defining some terms. By now you should probably have heard some of this in the news because we have been talking more about environmental justice, especially in this year of 2020 that has been such a challenging year for all of us. I think it's important to take a minute to realize how fortunate we all are to even be able to be here having this conversation when so many people are falling ill, are dealing with loss in their families, loss of the people they love, and also the hardships of the economic situations caused by COVID. So it's important for us to keep that in mind as we are having this conversation today. And it's in that context that I imagine that a lot of you have heard these terms that I'm going to be using today, at least some of them. So environmental justice is one of them that we're hearing more and more in the news recently. But it's not a new term, and it's not a new cause. In fact, I'm going to be sharing with you a little bit of the history of this term. But back in 1991, the People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit was an event that was held in Washington, D.C. And there was a conscious effort to make sure that this term environmental justice was defined. And it was defined based on another term called environmental racism, which means the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on people of color, which I will talk about. And specifically on low-income people of color, right? That's the two things are not the same, and they are intrinsically connected. And it's important to make sure that we understand that the two things are worthy of our thoughts and our understanding. Environmental justice is then the response, right? It's the people's response to environmental racism. And in that summit, it was very important for the group that was meeting there to make a stand and to actually voice their concerns about the way that the term had been used before, for example, for governmental agencies, by governmental agencies such as the EPA. And they explicitly said that they were concerned about how the term had been used to mention things like fair treatment and meaningful involvement of people of color, something that they consistently failed to accomplish, the government agencies. And it falls short of environmental justice vision, because the environmental justice that the movement wants to build is not just to redistribute harm, but to actually end harm. And you'll see this is going to come back later when we discuss climate change. So a little bit of history of why we're, when did this conversation about environmental justice actually became formalized? Well, it dates back to 1982, right? Back in that year in North Carolina, a specific manufacturer of electrical transformers dumped a whole bunch of toxic waste in this little town of Warren, which was predominantly African-American. And that was something that then stirred a number of protests. And I have many other examples, and well, not that I have, there are many other examples that you can find, but I just put here a little summary of the evidence that shows that people of color in general in this country will be exposed to greater environmental hazards than non-people of color. So just a little summary for you here. African Americans, the data shows they're 3 times more likely to die from asthma-related causes than white people, and that asthma can be traced back to exposure to hazardous substances because of the locations where these African Americans live. 50% of Latinos live in counties where air quality does not meet the EPA clean air standards. 50% is half of the Latinos in this country. Latinx, I should have changed my slide, sorry. Indigenous communities like the Navajo Nation live with the residual effects of uranium pollution in the water. As many as 54,000 Navajos are known to have suffered the harm. That's just one tribe. So this is a summary. There's plenty of evidence out there that there is a disproportionate amount of environmental harm that is that has historically been dealt with by these groups that usually, because of their socioeconomic situations, they don't have the voice to fight against this injustice, right? They don't have or they don't have the means to actually advocate for their own safety in the systems that they're part of, in the systems that they would have to navigate through in order to undo some of this harm. So why should we care? And by we here, I'm going to be qualifying us or grouping us in this really broad umbrella term here, we, as being mostly white and mostly privileged environmentalists. And I'm making this big assumption. I don't know who's on the call, but this is the we that I'm proposing we think about here. And so just want you to think from that perspective. But what should we be focusing on when we are trying to put ourselves in this position of people who care about the environment and who see in all of this a problem? Why should we get involved? Why should we care? So the first reason I'm going to give you is the fact that it's fundamentally wrong, right? There is something fundamentally wrong about allowing these injustice, this disproportionate harm. Hold on, I have to do with my dog. He's dreaming and it distracts me. Okay. So it is fundamentally wrong to be living in this way. I'm going to use here the words of a friend of mine, someone that I've collaborated with, Professor Raul Lejano, who is a professor at NYU. And I really like the way that he puts it. It's immoral and it's illegal, right? We need to be doing something about environmental justice so that we are not living out a crime, the crime being that we subsist on the suffering of others. So I'm going to give you a minute to take a look at this picture. This is the work of an artist that I really admire, Hugus Galencos. You can find his work on Instagram with that handle there. But I'm going to give you a minute just to look at this picture and read the caption of the picture. All right, so what's the point here, right? The point that I'm trying to make is that the way we live our lives in the developed world here in the United States, even though a lot of times we're not thinking about this, but the way we live our lives here in many ways determine the way that many other people live their lives elsewhere. The picture that you see here is just is contrasting here, high fashion models with the migrants in Bangladesh, in India. I'm not sure exactly where the city that this picture is taken from, but I know it's in India. And that's where most of the garments, not most, but a lot of the garments that we wear in the developed world are produced, right? And so having this understanding that that what we do, the choices we make in our lives are choices that will be affecting the lives of people who don't have as many choices as we do, that are limited in their resources or in their opportunities. And that has an impact on climate, and it will be connected with climate because the more we progress in this, not progress, but the worse the climate crisis becomes, the more pressure we're putting on these people who already survive with so little, right? Here's another picture by the same artist. I'm gonna also give you a minute to read, but I want to read the quote from Raoul again, in which he expands on that idea, that, you know, that we have the ability to access. Hold on, let me move my bar here. You know, we have lower cost vegetables because migrant farm workers are underpaid and overworked. We have lower cost garments because of sweatshops in places like Bangladesh. So we need to work for better living conditions in these other places in order for us to not be living out of crime. So here I'm expanding this discussion that we started in the US, right? We were talking at first about injustices that happen in the US. There are environmental justice issues. And I'm expanding now for us to think broadly about how this impacts people in other places of the world. So again, I'm going to give you a minute to take a look at the picture and read the caption on your own. All right, so that was my first point, right? That we should care about environmental justice because not caring about it is morally wrong, right? There's another line of argument that I want to share with you, which is the fact that we should care because if we care about the environment, right? If we want to protect the birds, if we want to protect the plants, the polar bears, the butterflies, whatever it is that has attracted us to this place in nature that makes us feel like we are environmentalists, right? We have to care about people. There is no way for us to protect all these elements of nature, elements of the environment, without actually addressing the human impacts and the complex relationships amongst us humans that will then affect and shape the environment. We must care about people, and we must care particularly about the poor and those that belong to these groups that have been historically oppressed, or else we're not going to make real progress protecting anything else. And so I'm going to try to show you the two main reasons for what that is, for why I believe this is the way it is. So the first reason I'm going to share with you is this simple notion that it's going to be really hard for you to convince anyone to help you save the animals, the environment, nature, to do any kind of change in their lives if they are struggling to meet their most basic needs, right? If someone is hungry, if someone is trying to provide for their family, and you come to them and you start talking to them about something that you think that they really need to do in order to make the environment better, that's not only cruel, but it's pointless, right? I don't know how many of you have experienced hunger in the way that I'm talking about here, the kind of hunger that we're addressing here. I haven't. I cannot imagine what it's like. I cannot imagine what it's like to not know how you're gonna feed your family. And this is something that we usually don't think about, but it's very much part of our lives. In fact, right now, it's predicted that because of the pandemic, after the months after the pandemic, we're going to have 1 in 6 Americans going hungry. Right now, we already have a huge number of Americans that go without. It's about 40 million people a year that report, going through food insecurity and not being able to provide for their family. So as you can imagine, the number of children are impacted by that. So how can you approach these communities, right? How can you approach people who are trying to survive and bring to them this notion that they also have to be doing all these other things here, to deal with the environment and the environmental quality, that it's something that is important to all of us. And we know from data that lifting people out of poverty in general will create improvements in the environmental conditions at a local and regional basis, right? So in general, when you see communities, and that's data that's coming from other countries again, when you see communities that are lifted out of poverty, you're going to see a decline in all what we call this point source environmental problems. So you see an improvement in issues related like littering, small scale illegal fishing, small scale poaching, issues related to like deforestation for subsistence farming, right? Regional and small scale pollution will all be reduced. But that's not really what we're dealing with right now. What we're dealing with are global crisis, right? So think about overfishing at a global scale. Plastic pollution is a tricky one because you do have some of it that is related with what individuals do on a daily basis. But think about the production of plastic, right? Think about large scale deforestation, right? I'm thinking about like massive soybean farms that are destroying the Amazon forest in my home country of Brazil, or large scale cattle ranching. And then of course we arrive at climate change. These are global crises, and these are systemic problems. So that's the other reason for why we need to protect the people who are most vulnerable, the people who don't have a voice, the people who are low income, who don't have a means to fight for their rights, because usually they're just really busy trying to meet their basic needs. This type of problem that we have here in our hands, specifically with climate change, we cannot be shoving this problem to those poor neighborhoods as we have been historically doing. So historically, what have we done? We put the factory in the poor neighborhood. That's what we do. We send the toxic waste to the poor neighborhood or to the reservation, or we dump it somewhere that people, even if they find out that that stuff is there, that they don't have the power to actually do anything about. That's historically what has been done. That's what the environmental justice began with. But now with climate change, we have a problem in our hands that cannot be sent to a location. It's what we call a transboundary problem. We create the emissions here and it spreads all over the world, and the effects are felt all over the world, although not equally. Although we know that the effects of climate change are being felt by those who have emitted the least, and by the way, who are also the poorest and have the least capacity to deal with adaptation and mitigation and all that. So climate change is a different type of environmental problem. And that's another reason why we need to protect those who are the most vulnerable. Because if we don't, we're going to allow for these systems to continue using this way of pushing the problem towards those who don't have a voice. And that means we're not solving the problem. Does that make sense to you? It means that we are just pushing forward. We're just postponing dealing with it further because we are just putting it under the rug, as we've been doing with other issues, and that will not lead us to solutions. So to deal really with climate change, we're going to require major change in policies and systems in regional and global markets. And reminding you all that most of the emissions can be tracked to 20 companies. Most of the emissions, right? Like most of the carbon dioxide emissions that we see going into the air can be tracked to 20 companies. This is what this graph is showing you here. And some of these, you know them very well, right? You know them really well. The dark bars show you state-owned companies. The yellow ones show you investor-owned companies. And then it's important to keep in mind the most emissions per capita, right? The most, the emissions data that you can track down to people's lifestyles. Most of these emissions come from the wealthiest nations, right? And they're associated with benefits to the wealthiest people within those nations. So we cannot deal with climate change, with the climate problem, without addressing the inequality problem. That's my point here, is that that's the other reason to be caring about environmental justice, besides the moral one, is the fact that if we don't deal with the climate justice and environmental justice portion of this problem, we're not really gonna get to the solution. All right, so how do we solve this? You know, what do we do? How do we deal with all of this? Well, one way is to look at what people have been calling intersectional environmentalism principles. So what is intersectional environmentalism? Well, it's this inclusive version of environmentalism that advocates for both the protection of people and the planet. It identifies the ways in which injustices are happening to marginalized communities and how those injustices and the earth are interconnected. That's just what we walked through, right? It brings injustices done to the most vulnerable communities and the earth to the forefront. So it does not try to say, okay, I don't have time to deal with all these other problems. Okay, economic inequality might be an issue, and racism might be an issue. But right now we have this emergency here, which is the climate emergency. So I cannot deal with these other problems right now. I have to focus on the climate. That will not lead us to the solution. That will just postpone, dealing with the problem. We have to tackle this problem from this very integrated, holistic approach. And that's what this is saying here. It's that intersectional environmentalism advocates for justice for people and the planet, right? This text is coming from a wonderful website that is maintained by this great author, Leah Thomas. So I highly recommend visiting her website. Okay, so to solve major global environmental problems such as climate change, we're going to need this confluence. We're going to need this combination of both bottom-up and top-down approach. And this is jargon, right? This is jargon that you're going to hear. I wanted to share some of this vocabulary with you so that you're familiarized. So when you read these articles or when you read websites or whatever, you talk to people, you will understand what people are talking about. So bottom-up approach are the ones that the community will bring up to the table. The community will create those approaches, those solutions, those strategies, and that will hopefully grow and get momentum. And then you can get, hold on, are you guys listening? Are you there? Because I don't see anybody right now. Okay, yes,
I'm still with you, Joanna.
Thank you. All right. All right, so that's the bottom-up approach, right? Is when the community starts a community-supported agriculture facility. It's when you have a group of environmentalists that decide to do something to empower the local communities that are, and give voice to those who are marginalized within that community. So this starts from the ground and then it grows and it gets momentum and then hopefully gets some kind of systemic support, from the government or from private sector. The top-down approach is the opposite. It's when the government passes regulations or legislation and then that gets distributed down to reach the communities in that way. We're going to need that. And we're also going to need the individual change in lifestyle, the things that we as individuals will be deciding how to adjust, right? And it's also going to require shutting down, transforming major industry sectors. There are some things that we as individuals, as one person only or a group of 5, 10 people will not be able to do that. Will have to be decided at a governmental level. Solving climate change will also require comprehensive, broad, sweep systemic changes. So that's what it means, depends on climate justice. And here I'm going to say something in the lines of the Green New Deal. I'm not going to be here going through the details of the Green New Deal. I am not going to try to explain the pros and cons, the strengths and the weaknesses, but I do want to voice here a general support for this approach. The approach of the Green New Deal is that we have this intersectional policy package. And an intersection is another jargon. It's another word that you might hear when you read articles about this, or you might read or hear when you talk to people, is that it's a package that addresses both the climate change problem and the economic inequality. And so there is a chance for success because of that, because it will be reforming, some of these issues that are part of the cause of the problem. All right. So hold on, next slide. Yep.
To that, the
time.
You're close. I think if you can hit this one, and then we'd be right on time, I think, with the next slide.
Okay. Well, let me see
until we get to the whiteboard.
Okay. All right. So I'm not going to go into the details of this then, since we don't have time. But if anyone wants to know more about policy window of opportunity, this is something that you learn when you take policy classes. I'll be happy to share. I think my point here was just that now is the time. Now is the time. it's the time, because we are hitting this perfect policy window moment. But well, if nothing else, we have to create that window ourselves. There is no more time if we want to avoid the most catastrophic effects of climate change, which would be associated with a 1.5 degrees Celsius warming globally on average. Then we have to do some serious cutting in emissions. All right, so then what can we all do? This is our discussion already here. So what I want to do now is I want to open for discussion. And I'm going to give you these questions, and then we're going to go to the whiteboard, and which is what Greg is referring to. It's a little activity that everyone is going to be able to participate. But before you go to the whiteboard, consider these questions here. Okay, with everything that I brought to you, that I'm offering here as the background information, let's call that. Now that you've seen all this and you're thinking about this, what can we do? What can we do, right? How can we properly amplify the voices of people of color at the forefront of these movements, what we call the frontline community, right? Well, how can we support these people? We here who are well-intended environmentalists, who are doing what the best we can to live good lives and to also be good people and to do good for the environment. Now that we know, and hopefully that at least we are somewhat convinced that this is important, how can we properly amplify the voices of these people? How do we educate ourselves better, right? Has our mission changed over time as environmentalists, right? Now knowing what we know. How do we pave the way and reach out to form new alliances and to support environmental justice? And how do we build community around environmental justice? So these are the questions I want you to be thinking about. And then this is the activity that we prepared for you. So what we want to do, Greg, do you mind giving the instructions on how people can put their pin?
Yeah, thanks, Joanna. So what we'd like everyone to do is, if you see on the top of your screen a green bar where it says you're viewing Joana Tavares' screen, there's a view options to the right of that. If you click that drop down and go to the annotate menu, you'll see some stamps that you can use there. And you can choose a stamp. And if you just want to look at these 4 options here, we kind of want to get a sense where everybody is at. And if you can just put a stamp in the phrase or description that fits you the best, that would be perfect. And then Joanna's going to kind of tailor the rest of her presentation around this, and maybe we can have our focused discussion around that as well. I see everybody's doing that pretty well. So again, it's under the view options drop down, should be at the top of your screen, and then look for the annotate menu under that and click that. You'll bring up a toolbar. You can choose one of the stamps from the stamp option. Okay. Good. I think we're getting a kind of a good sense of where most people on the call are falling. Already convinced we must do more to promote EJ, but don't know where to start, or already engaged in environmental justice work and looking for more support, help, and resources for specific projects. So this is great. And I think you can continue to do that, but I want to go ahead and let Joanna continue with her presentation with that kind of information behind us. Or if we want to take some questions at this point, or if we want to add a few thoughts, Joanna, based on where everybody's at.
I think we're ready to. I do want to add some. I'm just going to go over kind of like a big list of action items that I think will help some of the people who are in these 2 quadrants. Thank you so much for thinking with us here and filling out this activity. I'm going to move on to the next slide. Oh, this is so cute. Look at that. Your stamps stayed for a minute to remind us that you're still there. This is so weird, guys, to give this presentation here over Zoom. It's I know this is it's the way we have to do it, and I'm not complaining, I promise. I'm not whining, but it is hard as a speaker that usually gives these workshops in person to not miss you all, to not miss being in the room with you and seeing your faces. So for people in those 2 quadrants, they're gonna have to interpret this a little bit differently. But here is a very broad list of ideas that we can then go into the details when we start asking questions and answering them back and forth. The first one is, well, we can all educate ourselves about environmental justice, right? Thank you, Louis. I see your stamp there. Hi, Jane. This is so cute. You guys are there. All right. So understanding these connections are not simple things to understand. It takes time. It takes a lot of thinking. It takes reading. It takes conversations with other people to really get to the bottom of what are the causes and consequences of environmental harm, environmental crises, environmental issues. You know, just so having this, dedicating time for this is the first step if you're not engaged in environmental justice particularly. I'm gonna highlight here the sense of identity that I tossed in here. You know, like there are these connections between environmental problems and health. Those are usually the easiest to grasp. In education, of course, economics, but there's this sense of identity that I put here in this bundle because I want you guys to start thinking about this. How is it that our values that we build over the years from our childhood, you know, the things that we like, the kind of car that we like to drive, the kind of clothes we like to wear, our heroes, the books we read, the films we've watched, the people that we identify with, how are all these factors shaping the problems that we see in the real world, you know? So a lot of thinking that needs to be done, I think, in this here in this item. Identify opportunities in your own circles and communities to support EJ. So I see a lot of groups forming reading groups. That's awesome. You know, book clubs that are reading books about environmental justice. That's wonderful. I think the next step is to reach out to the community that needs your support. You know, try to listen to them, try to ask them, what are the resources we can try to funnel to you? What is it that we can serve as better allies to you, group that already is organizing in my community? Support policies and policy champions. There are series about environmental justice. We can talk more about that in the Q&A. Prioritize environmental justice in all decisions you make, right? Not just what you shop for, but where and how you shop, where you invest, where you do your banking, who do you hire and how you hire people, if that's something that you do in your life. I have other tips there. And then be prepared to have uncomfortable conversations. You know, I'm not talking about antagonizing anybody. I'm not talking about confronting anybody. I'm talking about continue these conversations, finding the language to bring up conversations and bring them up in a way that is positive. Learn to listen to what other people have to say so that you can actually have dialogues that can make everybody grow. Okay, so with that, so that we have time, this is a really cool table that Greg shared with me. I have suggested readings and all this good stuff, but I think I'm gonna do is I'm gonna stop my presentation right now and I'm gonna stop sharing. And then this way oh, I see faces. Whew. So questions, let's talk.
While some of you are thinking of your questions, I've got, I did want to share one thing, and this is just because we are the California Naturalist Program community, and I wanted to make sure people knew some of the things that we're doing in our program, and I'll just highlight three very quickly, and it kind of relates to that category of, you know, we're aware of the problem, we're trying to do more, that quadrant of your whiteboard. But really, and it touches on some of the examples you gave as well, but really building new relationships with new organizations and partners. That's one of our big key objectives. Another one is increasing the relevance, educating ourselves and increasing the relevance of our content to some of the issues that are most relevant to people that are facing environmental justice issues. And then the third one that I just highlight is that taking some responsibility to educate ourselves as individuals as well as a program, including things like hosting this type of webinar. And I know all of our partners are trying to do very similar things, but I just wanted to share that and maybe give some time for others to share maybe what they're doing or any questions they have. I
see one question from Susie. Susie, I'm not sure about share the video, but I'm gonna let others answer, but I can start answering the question. Right, this is a very important point. You know, finding the right credit card company and bank, that's something that I've been working. It's part of my New Year's resolution, actually. I'm gonna be completely switching. I'm gonna be switching next year, pretty much everything that I do in terms of my financials in order to prioritize that. So I don't feel comfortable sharing my own personal findings on this front, Susie, but I can point you to some resources and you can do your own reading. There will always be pros and cons, and you really have to look closely. You have to really go into the fine print there to figure out where to go. But I would say in general, what is it called? Oh, come on, people, help me out here. It's the small banks that
Credit unions.
Credit unions, thank you. Just completely. Credit unions, yes, that's what I am starting. And there are some bigger banks now that are promising that they're gonna be doing things differently. So you should also keep an eye out for the big banks. But the credit unions, I would say, is a good place to start.
Other questions? And anyone from the team, if you're seeing anything in the chat that you want to verbalize the question for everyone, that'd be great.
Yeah, Greg, and this is for you. How is the California Naturalist Program partnering with the UCCE Master Gardeners?
Well, there's a lot of different individual collaborations, mostly on a small scale with Master Gardeners. I don't want to get too much into that. I see Brad. I will send you a separate note with some examples, but I want to keep most of our questions focused on our guest speaker today so that she can respond. We have another question?
Oh, we have questions coming in. I'm so excited because, like I said, I couldn't see your faces, so I did not know if you were like enjoying my talk, if I was going in the right direction. So if everything that I said was so boring because you already knew everything. So one question here, is it palatable yet for conservationists to target excess consumption of richer populations? We're targeting unsustainable population growth in poorer populations at the same time. I don't know about palatable, but these are important topics and they're complicated, very complicated, okay? So the first thing I think that I'm gonna bring up here is the importance of proportions, size, right? So in terms of excess consumption, I'm going to start with the excess consumption of richer populations. It's a big issue, right? It is part of the problem. But when you look at the rankings of what most of the emissions are coming from, the things we buy, although important for many reasons, as we said, not just because of the actual emissions associated with the thing we're buying, but also what it means for the system, you know, what companies are we supporting when we do that. But consumption of goods is actually not as big as the emissions associated with other things. And actually, let me share my screen again, and I'm gonna show you this. Hold on. So I have here. This is the per capita greenhouse gas emissions by sector. Okay, the data is from 2016, but it's still it kind of is the same trend that we see, I think, to this date. So as you can see, electricity and heat is like the number one thing that emissions are coming from when you look on a per capita basis. Transport, right? Buildings. The manufacturing, you know, the manufacturing that is being listed here is mostly bundled with construction. But as you can see, we have these other big issues to be discussing. So I'm not dismissing the importance of discussing consumption. I'm just saying that it's important to focus these conversations on what is most relevant in terms of amount of emissions, if that is the goal. Does that make sense? So when we talk about consumption of richer populations, I am mostly concerned with the size of the houses and where those houses are located. How much heating does it take to heat that house in the winter? That's what I wanted people to be thinking about more. Or air conditioning in the summer as well. If we are going to talk about consumption, we have to discuss the fact that, okay, so we're going to be telling the rich to consume less, but then we're also going to have to be somehow giving this message to everyone, right? And then how do we deal with people who have not had access to goods for so long, and now they're finally getting access to some of these goods? So there's a little balance. Okay, population, really quickly. Again, tricky, complicated, because in a lot of those locations, you're talking about poorer populations, right? I can say in other countries, for example, having more kids is a source of joy. It's a source of joy. It's also a source of help in the land that you're working. So there's a lot of complex issues there. But I can tell you what has actually been proven over and over to, it's actually one of the top things we could do globally to deal with climate change: educate young women. Educate young women. It's one of the top things we should be doing globally. As we educate young women, they tend to have fewer children. The children will be healthier. They live longer lives, and they also have these children later in life. So there are different ways to look at that. I don't know if that helped answer the question, but does that? Pretty big, right? But good questions. Okay. Only
Did you
direct
want to
connected.
highlight another question?
Yes.
Brooke?
Brooke, did you see one there that I can? Sorry, I went really far on that one. It's a really good question.
That's fine. We're getting a mix of questions and comments and some responses to the questions.
One person asked about where they can identify where they live on, what native land they live on. We put a link in there if you didn't see it. We have someone asked, this is indirectly connected to the discussion, but on a political note, if environmental groups get together to strengthen the US Green Party, will it have more impact? Would that contribute to environmental justice goals?
That's a great question. I am not associated with the Green Party, but I do think the environmentalists need to be thinking about the political and aspects of the work of the environmentalist. And so I can point you to some groups that are not necessarily a political party like the Green Party, but that are really doing a lot of heavy lifting on the front of lobbying in the political arenas. One of them is the Citizens Climate CCL. It's the Citizens Climate Lobby. Did I say this right? Elliot, thank you. I'm dyslexic, so sometimes I'll say things completely like scrambled, like acronyms. They're a real problem for me. But this group is fantastic. They've been doing great work, and they are an example of how an environmentalist can be more engaged in this political arena of pushing for legislation and pushing for and then another group that I'm a big fan is the Sunrise Movement. These are kids, and I would say they are fantastic. These are amazing people, and they need a lot of support and help. So check them out, and they are doing a lot of work on the lobbying front. And I don't know much about the Green Party here in the United States. I was involved in Brazil. Here it's a little bit different, but hopefully that's helpful. Okay, another question.
Joanna, we have a comment, and I think it ties in with something you said earlier about giving voice to affected communities. But Dr. Maren Lender, who is our founding director for the California Naturalist Program, said, suggesting that we show more of what environmental stewards, activists, and leaders from underserved communities are currently doing to shine and help shine the light on their efforts. And just a side note, a little plug here, the new UC Climate Stewards course will be highlighting as part of that curriculum a textbook that Adina has written that does actually look at a number of examples of community actions around climate change, some of which deal with environmental justice issues.
Absolutely. And here I'm going to suggest people check out CEJA. It's the California Environmental Justice Alliance. Their website is Caleja, CALEJA.org. They are a statewide organization, and they will have a lot of, their work is amazing. But what was the original comment that we should highlight those voices, right? That we should amplify those voices? Absolutely. A lot of times these voices are hidden because they're not specifically attached to the word environmental. They're doing environmental work, but it's not using the word environmental. So a lot of times it's about going to find in your community, the community supported agriculture places, or the market, the flea market. These communities, they have organizers, they have people, and a lot of times they're not going to be willing for you to just walk in and say, oh, I'm here to help you. What can I do? I want to amplify your voice. That's not how it works. You have to build trust. You have to find a way to actually be trusted within those communities. I think that's the right way to amplify those voices, is by taking the time to get to know the groups you're working with, and then allow them to know you, and form these partnerships. And then when that is done, then you open up and you bring the people in a way that you can actually, that that when you bring them in for your own meeting in your church group or in your book club or in your environmental group, that they will be well received, and that the people that will be there attending that event will have been prepared for that conversation.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. And I appreciate that, Joana. I think we only have time for one really quick question before we begin to wrap up. So there was a question about any legislation that you think, if you had to choose one piece of legislation that might help this issue of environmental justice and climate change, is there anything that jumps to mind? And
yeah, put a price on carbon. So the stuff that is being championed by the CCL group that I mentioned, I like that a lot. We got to start internalizing the externality of carbon. So put a price on carbon, cut subsidies for fossil fuels now, yesterday. Come on, we cannot be subsidizing fossil fuels anymore.
All right.
Yeah, that's it.
On that note, I can see that's a very strong response. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up on that note. I want to first of all thank Joana for sharing her wealth of knowledge and experience and all her insights with us today. She's reminding us of the inextricable connection between our work as naturalists and stewards and environmental justice, which we just can't separate. I also want to thank Brooke and our team for the third of this series, the Cones series, and really doing a great job getting us started. And I know we're going to continue this into 2021, so we hope you'll all join us with that as well. And then finally, I want to thank all the people that joined this call. We hope you are getting something out of this series. I know today's session was great. If you've joined the other ones, I think you'd like those as well. So stay tuned to the Cones, bookmark the Cones website, and we hope you'll join us again in the future. I'm going to turn it over to Brooke right now. She's going to cover one more piece of kind of housekeeping regarding our evaluation. But I want to thank again Joana for joining us and sharing, and all of you for being part of this new community of practice. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for participating today. We do hope to see you again. We want to know a lot more about you. We want to hear your thoughts about today's presentation, the lineup. We've had this, environmental justice focus this fall, and that will change a little bit, but still be part of the lineup in 2021. So your ideas moving forward would be really helpful. And I put an evaluation link in the chat. We've gotten really low turnout for the evaluation. So if you have an opinion, we'd love to hear it. Coming up in January, or starting in January, we have a full slate of presentations for you, and those will be announced soon. And we're also filling the calendar with climate stewards courses around the state. So be on the lookout on our calendar on our homepage or through social media. That's where we'll be promoting that information. And yeah, with that, we just hope that you have a safe and relaxing holiday season, and we'll see you in the new year. And again, thank you so much for being here, Joana, and thank you all for contributing to this community.